As I do with every broadcast, let me salute all veterans, active duty service members, firefighters, and policemen and women. Without you, there is no democracy or safety within our communities. That being said, this is the Gabby Mack Project. Now, tonight I'm going to be talking about the history of minstrel shows. Now, what got me interested in this subject, right? Well, I was watching some old black and white clips of early comedic acts. And I have to tell you, the more I watched, the more infuriated I became when I saw how black people were portrayed back in the day. It was absolutely shameful. So, me being me, I did some research to see how this form of entertainment evolved. So, I'm going to take whatever time it takes to share what I found. What I found. I can see how early white people in America developed their stereotypes of black people. I mean, slaves. But sadly, as I was writing this report, I had a revelation. That revelation being that minstrel shows continue today. Yes, I said it. Today, right now. We in the black community continue the minstrel tradition. I'm hoping someone hearing this will say, Gabby, please slow down. This is 2021. We don't have minstrels in today's America. I beg to differ. Now, stay with me, stay with me. Maybe you'll see the connection as we go along. Okay, so let's begin. Now, I went to Wikipedia to get their definition of what a minstrel show was, and here it is what they said. Minstrel shows were an American form of racist entertainment that began in the 1830s and remained popular through the 1880s. Very popular with the masses. Now, let's talk about how these shows were presented. Well, you had a group of white actors who blackened their faces and then would engage in outrageous behavior and exaggerated mannerisms to illustrate black folks' speech and behavior. They always depicted black people in negative racist stereotypes, and that's being polite. Now, on the political side, minstrel groups were the perfect vehicles to spread the racist ideology that black people were inferior to whites. So let's dig a little deeper into that. Remember that old truism that he who rules writes the history? And that was true in early America. You see, early American history was written by white men of European descent. These men were able to craft their version of history and then spread it to the masses. And you have to remember that most of the so-called scholars back then believed in and supported slavery. They believed their race, the white race, was alone civilized. So when you believe that, it was easy to develop an ideology that enslaved Africans were inferior and deserved to be subjugated by white people. When you think like that, it's easy to justify and accept the brutalization of black slaves. So when a minstrel show came to a village or town, the average white man who was poor had little, if any, contact with black slaves in their everyday life. So when they saw these caricatures of black people, they accepted them as fact. These minstrel shows went on for many years, and a lot of damage was done during that time. Think about it. Night after night, day after day, audiences were seeing black-faced white actors portray black people as being ignorant, lazy, buffoonish, superstitious, joyous, and musical. Let's talk about it. Now, the first actor to come out with this kind of performance was a man named Thomas Wright, who in 1828 created the Jim Crow character. In his show, Wright would darken his face, act like a buffoon, and speak with an exaggerated and distorted imitation of black people's way of speaking English. not their native tongue, English. Okay, everyone has heard of the Mandingo stereotype. You know, that big black guy who has a big penis with a voracious sexual appetite. Well, that caricature was also used by white slave owners to reinforce the ideas that blacks were uncivilizable. Now, two of the worst black female stereotypes was the Sapphire and Jezebel stereotypes. Let's talk about the Sapphire stereotype. You know, that black woman who is domineering, strong, masculine, a workhorse who worked in the fields alongside the men. The minstrels portrayed her as an aggressive, overbearing woman that drove away her men and her children. Now I ask you if that sounds the least bit familiar. Now, the other really nasty stereotype of the black femme was a Jezebel. You know, the black woman who is hypersexual. But in reality, the Jezebel stereotype is contradicted by several historical facts. You see, black women, especially those with brown tan skin and European features, were sometimes forced into prostitution for white men. You see, slavers often encouraged and sometimes mandated sexual promiscuity among their slaves. But it's never mentioned that when slaves were allowed to marry, adultery was frowned upon in most black communities. Now, all of these portrayals were harmful to the black persona. But I believe the two most damaging stereotypes were the Sambo and Uncle Tom stereotypes. Just to show how distorted history can be depending on who writes it. For example, the Sambo character was actually based on a children's book titled The Story of Little Black Sambo, written by Ian Bannerman in 1899. In the book, there was an Indian boy from India named Sambo. He was forced to give up his clothes and belongings to four tigers so they wouldn't eat him. Now, the problem wasn't the story, it was the pictures that were in the book. You see, Sambo is depicted as having very dark skin, with wide eyes, a broad nose, and a wide smile. Over time, Sambo came to be representative of black men who were considered very happy, usually laughing, lazy, irresponsible, and carefree. Most likely, most of y'all are too young to remember that there was a restaurant chain called Sambo's back in the day. Thankfully, it no longer exists. And as I said earlier, the list of minstrel characters is very long. But I'll end this walk down memory lane by talking about the Uncle Tom stereotype. Now, that stereotype was based on a book titled Uncle Tom's Cabin. And long story short, the book was about a black man who was simple-minded and always ready to assist the white man. These stereotypes made it easy for some government officials to use these caricatures as evidence that slavery was justified because it was a way to protect blacks from themselves. Now, even the U.S. Secretary of State said in 1844 that people of African descent were incapable of self-care and would sink into lunacy under the burden of freedom. It is a mercy to give them guardianship and protection from mental death. So you see, slavery was for our best interest. Now, even after slavery ended, many learned people questioned the intellectual capacity of black people. One of those was a man named Lewis Terman, who wrote in The Measurement of Intelligence in 1916, quote, "Black and other ethnic minority children are ineducatable beyond the nearest rudiments of training. No amount of school instruction will ever make them intelligent voters or capable citizens in the sense of the word. Their dullness seems to be racial, or at least inherent in the family stock from which they come." Unquote. But you see, Truman was not alone. Many white people thought that way. And that kind of thinking was reinforced with the release of a movie in 1950 entitled Birth of a Nation. It was a 3 hours long movie, but it was a resounding success, making almost $100 million. Now, I've seen the movie. You talk about propaganda? Wow. Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. I'm going to give you a short synopsis. The movie tells the turbulent story of American history in the 1860s. As I said, it was 3 hours long, and it followed the fictional, I say again, fictional lives of two white families, one from the North and one from the South. Now, during the entire movie, all 3 hours, African Americans were portrayed as brutish, lazy, and morally degenerate. Now, all of the movie is objectionable, but one of the most objectionable scenes shows the Ku Klux Klan riding to the rescue of a white family trapped in a cabin by sexually predatory blacks and their white manipulators. Need I tell you that the main actors were white in blackface? Sound familiar? I have a question for you. You young heads probably can't relate, but you might have someone in your family who can ask this question. Ask them if they remember the Amos and Andy TV show. That show was seen on TV from 1951 through 1953. But you see, the TV show was actually based on a successful radio broadcast that began in 1926. And par for the course, the people on that broadcast were white. And although the TV show was taken off the air, the Amos and Andy radio broadcast lasted until 1960, a 40-year run. And guess what? It was the most popular show ever broadcasted. It was on air 15 minutes, 5 days a week. It too used the 100-year minstrel tradition of using white actors to portray blacks in blackface comedy acts. But, during the 20s and 30s, there were far more demeaning caricatures of black people, such as the Mac and Morans, Buck and Wheats, Anesthetic and Cerebellums. These types of shows crowded the airwaves. And you know what? White audiences love to watch these racial cliches. But let's not get it twisted. Many African Americans were also avid fans of the show. So from the 20s to the 1950s, these were the images seen and heard across America. Now this is where you and I probably or may agree or disagree. I believe that the minstrel tradition is alive and well today. It's just that we, as black people, have replaced the white actors in blackface. Now, I say that because some of our black actors and actresses continue the tradition of playing roles that perpetrate minstrel typecasting of black people. We see it every day. It isn't hard to find some black person to be a thug or a maid. Now, in the 70s and 80s, when black moviegoers got tired of movies portraying blacks as mammies, Tom, tragic mulattoes, etc., they were willing to exchange those old negative caricatures for new ones. Brutes, bucks, and Jezebels, Sambos, were replaced by the Superman black man. the drug kingpin, or the criminal, etc. And these new caricatures were popularized by more than 200 mostly B-grade films that were later called black exploitation movies. But the Hollywood stereotyping furthered the racial stereotype that black men were dangerous and drawn to illicit activities. Repeated over and over and over again, it's becoming ingrained in the societal brain as a representation of the black Americans. And let's talk about daytime TV. Reality shows like Phil Donahue, Sally Jesse, Jerry Springer, and Maury presented the absolute worst examples of black people. You know, Maury's been on since 1991? That's 20 years. But we watch and we spend our money on the products sold during those commercials. Then there's the hip hop shows, the housewives of this or that. So I reiterate my earlier point. There has been a revitalization of the menstrual tradition, and we are the purveyors. Guilty is charged. This is the new menstrualization of the black experience. In closing, here's Gabby Max 25 cents. You can't get mad if we perpetrate stereotypes and the negative, what I call urban legends about ourselves. But let me add, I just want to sign on to what Kevin Samuels talks about a lot. And that is, we can't change the image of black people until black people own the media and production companies themselves. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. My next broadcast is titled, I'm Mad as Hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Until next time, please hit the like button and support the channel. I'm Gabby Mack. I am signing off.